This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Scooter Altman, president of the Space Operating Group for ASRC Federal. Our hosts then discuss the latest news, including NASA's skinny budget, the implications and pushback, and the reason why Erik Schmidt bought Relativity Space.
Scooter, it's good to see you.
Hey, good morning, David. Good to see you too.
Yeah, we've got a lot to dig into this conversation. You're a veteran of 4 space shuttle missions, test pilot, retired Navy captain, head of Space Operating Group. But just to kind of get this out of the way, I think I'd like to sort of kick this off with just a piece of Americana in a way. I mean, back in '86 when the movie Top Gun came out, you did a few of the aerial stunts, including the buzzing of the tower and that famous scene where Tom Cruise's character Maverick flips the bird to the MiG pilot. Is that about accurate?
Those are all accurate. Yes, each of those scenes I was in. It was a lot of fun filming that movie. It was a little different than standard Navy flying, but pretty fun being out there, working with the camera crews, Hollywood. We even flew the actors for about a week till the director said, stop, because I'm not using this in the movie because the guys all look kind of green. But
right. Yeah, you don't usually get to buzz the tower
no. Normally, you could every time you come back. Said, hey, I feel like buzzing the tower. There's nothing to stop you from doing it. But when you landed afterwards, a staff car would drive up. A guy would get out and rip your wings off and tell you that's it for you. You're not flying anymore. So when they said, Scott, would you mind buzzing the tower? I was like, yeah. And they said, we want to make sure we get it on camera, so we need to do it like 9 times. Would that be okay? I'm like,
I've heard that. I heard they did it 9 times, buzzing the tower. It's sort of the dream of any Navy pilot. All right, let's fast forward. So fast forward to maybe those 4 space shuttle missions. And I kind of wanted you to sort of look at those in comparison to where we are today. Because, there's just been such an evolution in terms of the nature of space, commercial space, where the industry has gone, and, how we sort of got from there to here, and maybe what you see in between.
Well, it's something that we were looking at from the beginning of the time I got to NASA. What was the next thing after the space shuttle? How would we make that transition? The shuttle was a great pickup truck, and that's basically what it was built to be, a pickup truck to take things from Earth to low Earth orbit and then bring payload back. And that's something that we really don't have today, an easy way to get significant amounts of payload back. Dragon has some capability, but nothing like what the shuttle had. But at the same time, it was also limited to going to low Earth orbit. You couldn't go further. And we always wanted to extend our reach further out into the solar system to go back to the moon and eventually go on to Mars. And I know I was part of a team that was looking at a mission to Mars. We were planning at one point, when I got there in '95, looking at 2015, could we do a mission to Mars at that point? And I was like, well, if we do it then, I'll be senior enough to write my name on the manifest, and I could be the person that goes to Mars. But we didn't get there.
2015. I mean, that's just kind of unpack that. It's a decade ago.
Right. And we're looking back at that now, and we didn't get anywhere close to being able to do that.
Yeah.
Some of the different things that happened is we built the space station, which was an incredible achievement. Having a space truck was a key part of that. But at the same time, it limited you, like I said, from what you could do. You needed to transition to that next vehicle. And that transition was a lot harder than I think NASA expected when we shut the shuttle down in 2011 and didn't really have a way to fly until 2019. And that turned out to be the commercial crew effort that I had started working on back in 2004 when I had a detail to NASA headquarters.
Yeah.
But it is an exciting time right now that we do have that capability to do both NASA missions and commercial missions. SpaceX has taken over the commercial crew transport. They also have the supplies ships that are going there now to take supplies up to the station so that Butch and Sonny could get a new supply of clothes while they were stuck up there for a while. But it's an amazing progress that we've made, how much commercial space has come along, mostly being funded and supported by the government.
Right. I want to get into sort of the commercial transition, but first, before we do, I want to sort of get back to that 2015 number because it sort of jives with a lot of what I've heard over the years from veterans within the space community. I mean, I think there was a thinking, like 69 were on the moon, 79 were on Mars, 89 were on, the Titan,
Yeah, yeah.
2000 were in Proxima Centauri, like there was this perception, I think, of the early germination of the space industry that saw this just steady progression of humanity out into the cosmos, and it just didn't happen in many ways. And maybe that's just part of the boom and bust cycles of anything. But I wonder what your perspective is on that, and sort of where that sort of lag came from, and how it's maybe resurged.
Yeah, it is a little disappointing that we weren't able to keep moving. Now, you also have to look at the funding level that happened that made Apollo possible. And then what happened as we transitioned to shuttle, the Vietnam War funding really hurt NASA with the final Apollo missions, having those extra Saturn V's scattered around the country that never flew, kind of sad after they were built and everything. But we still hoped that the shuttle would be a stepping stone. And in the end, it kind of became a trap to some extent in that it was something we had, we didn't want to give it up. And that transition is always hard. I think when they went from Apollo to the shuttle, there was a huge layoff down there at the Cape. And it was only, took a while to build it back up. When we let go of the shuttle, the same thing happened, but now we're on the other side. Maybe it is the boom and bust, but we're on the boom side of the curve right now. And
Yeah.
hopefully it's for both NASA and commercial space because they're very intertwined as we work together moving forward.
Yeah, I remember reading that layoffs back at the time happened as late as the end of 1969, which is sort of, almost just this interesting situation. I mean, we ended up going to the moon several more times after that,
Right.
but there was a transition almost like land, sort of the boots and flags component of this. And, I wonder in the context of sort of for modern space, when we talk about Mars and talk about all these other things, there's a national prestige aspect to all of this, but there's also a sustainability aspect that was not what we had in the 1960s and 70s. And this seems a little bit different, maybe buttressed by the fact that the commercial sector is so heavily involved. But I wonder in the context of what you mentioned with Dragon, that you see a lot of missions now, huge launch cadence. But the vast majority of these are robotic missions. We do have some commercial astronauts, and we do have some
Right.
capabilities of cargo, like you mentioned with Dragon. But I wonder as we start to transition toward more commercial human space flight, where that risk tolerance is, and can the commercial sector still be as aggressive as it wants to be if it sort of maintains that sort of age-old mantra of move fast and break things.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough thing to live with in space flight because there's pretty serious consequences when you make the wrong move there. And that is a challenge we're going to have to deal with as we move forward. What is the acceptable pace? What are the risk levels? NASA has been criticized in the past for being too risk averse and trying to protect the astronauts maybe too much. But at the same time, you have a catastrophe like Challenger or Columbia, and it really sets everything back. And
Right.
even on robotic missions, they're very expensive also. How many failures can you really tolerate financially before you can't afford to continue?
I mean, that's a really interesting point because it's not only about, I mean, protecting humans in space is obviously a huge concern, but it's not only about that. It's the sense of the momentum of the industry. And I
Right.
and I wonder, what the threshold or what the tolerance is in the investor community and how they look at that as you sort of go forward if you have some of these failures that would result in God forbid the unthinkable.
Right. And that is the challenge is figuring out exactly what the return on investment can be for those folks who put some serious money into it because it is expensive. It's hard to move things from the surface of the earth to accelerate them to 25 times the speed of sound. That's an awful lot of energy being expended, which makes it a very dangerous proposition. But you've got to be able to do that to be able to get to these places that we need to go to have a return on investment.
Right.
So that's probably the biggest challenge is what is that big app out there that is going to be the driver to push things beyond the tourist level that we're seeing right now. I think there is going to be a forcing function that drives us to do that. John Young, who I had an office with when I first got to NASA, had flown on all the vehicles from you know, Gemini, Apollo, and Shuttle. And his mantra was, hey, look at the evidence here on Earth. Single planet species don't survive long term. We need to push humanity out further beyond Earth. There's a whole challenge about our local resources being depleted. I think that's a long vision from where we are today, but I think it's a goal we need to keep pushing forward to expand humanity beyond just Earth.
I wonder also in the context of this era that we're in now, it's not just necessarily the commercial side of things, but what this era has in common with the 1960s is that there's a rival, and that the nature of that rival. I had somebody describe to me once, there will be a lunar economy because China is going to be there. And that in of itself maybe is the germinating seeds that fosters the beginnings of something bigger. I'm just curious what your perspective is on that.
Well, we have seen a lot about what China has been doing in space, and they're being very aggressive. You're right. Uh, they're basically started off more like a Soviet era mission, but they've demonstrated capability. They built a space station. They're traveling to it now, back and forth, and they have designs on the moon. There's a concern about who gets there first. Can we have um, a lunar environment that is free to all? Or if the Chinese are on the South Pole first, is it, hey, who gets there firstest with the mostest or not? So,
Right. And then when you look at the U.S. side, and you see what SpaceX is doing, and you also see what Rocket Lab is doing, and what Blue Origin sort of hopes to do, and so all these new companies, and you see three lunar lander companies that are sort of making their efforts. Um, I wonder in that context, with all these planned launches and the thousands of more satellites that we have, coming on orbit, there's this concern about capacity and
right.
infrastructure, and will that will that create a bottleneck in terms of the efforts that want to be somewhere and potentially could be there, but don't necessarily have just the bare sort of lighthouse effect of the launch pads and wind tunnels, and all the sort of the federal sort of aspects of what it takes to develop a healthy rocket industry.
Right. And you are exactly right. The pace of launch has picked up incredibly from where we were in the shuttle days, where it took 2 weeks between launching somebody from the Cape and the next launch to reconfigure the range and have everything ready. Now you're having two SpaceX launches on the same day, which
Right.
boggles my mind. And they're
There
talking
was one
about,
this year that was 4 minutes apart, and I think one in
wow,
Vandenberg and then down in the Cape.
yes, yeah, multi-coast and right
Yeah.
now on top of each other. Um, it is to still, even with the capability expansions we've made, there's a potential for a huge bottleneck as so many more players come onto the stage and want to launch. There's only so many places that are safe to launch into the same orbital inclinations that we want to go to. Um, but the positive thing is we're getting better at doing that faster. I think someone's going to have to manage the pace and separate the traffic. I know the U.S. decided that the Commerce Department was the right person to do the space traffic management, and NOAA is looking at doing that right now.
Well, that's what I
So,
wanted to ask you about. So, in the context of this, like that, managing the traffic on orbit is the other side of this, right? And if it's within NOAA and the Office of Space Commerce, and that's an office that's seen a decent amount of cuts in last month, and there's just sort of this like quiet little office there that has been doing this thing that space companies really rely upon.
right.
That I wonder what that actually means when sort of the rubber hits the road in terms of actually operating up there.
Yeah, that it looks challenging right now with the cuts that we've seen, and we had a contract that was supporting NOAA doing that, and we're not sure how many of the civil servants remain right now on that contract, which is going to make it difficult for it to fully operate. Um, it is a critical piece of the infrastructure. There's the licensing of the launches and then the management of the traffic and ensuring that everything that goes up has a plan for the end of life because it's not going to be up there forever. You want to make sure that things aren't falling on people's heads as they deorbit. To have satellites are supposed to be designed now with the idea that they will disintegrate on the way back and not have a credible threat to humans. There's a few things up there right now that aren't designed to that standard, and the Hubble Space Telescope is one of them. It's got some parts that are definitely going to re-enter, make it all the way to the ground. So NASA has to decide, do they boost it up or send something up to deorbit it at some point?
Right. All right. In a little bit of time that we have left, I kind of want to just take a step back here and just maybe get a bit of a broader picture. Just uh, did you always know that you wanted to do this? Did you want to be an astronaut? Is like where did this come from? Is it just, one of these things that's just sort of built on itself, or was there sort of a
Well,
moment?
I have to admit, it was a series of incredible events, like Leonard Pershing, a series of unusual things happened. I started off at 3 years old telling my mom and dad I'd like to be a pilot when I grow up. And they said, three things. One, do your best. Two, work hard. And three, never give up on your dreams. And those were key things that I went for because at certain points in my career, people told me no. Like when I thought the way to become a pilot was go to the Air Force Academy, and I got an appointment, everything was going great till I took the physical, and they said, your sitting height is too tall to be an Air Force pilot. So then there's my dream crushed. But I went to school, studied engineering, and found out the Navy had different height standards. So I became a Navy pilot and got to achieve my dream there. Uh, Went through the training program, got selected for jets, sent out to Miramar, was flying that, and then thought, well, I should use my engineering degree. And I went to test pilot school. We took a field trip to NASA, and I met actual astronauts and realized two things. One, astronauts are actually real people. I don't think I believed that before. And two, I really want to do this. So I signed up, actually got an interview, went to NASA, came home, and when I got the call, they said, no, we don't want you as an astronaut. But I said, all right, I'll try again. They had another call for applications. I submitted my package. I actually went on cruise and was in the Persian Gulf when I got a call on the satellite phone saying, hey, Scooter, can you come to NASA for another interview? And the skipper checked with CAG and let me off the ship. And I flew home and interviewed. And then this time they said yes. So I
I,
worked my way.
What I like most about this story is that just sort of the willingness just not to accept no, I think for an answer. And I think that's something that a lot of people maybe need to sort of hear a bit because rejection comes in any kind of profession,
Right,
anywhere you're
right.
at. Just maybe just the sense of attrition that you're just gotta kind of grind it out at some point. All right.
Yeah. That's exactly one of my messages. It's not that's what happens when somebody tells you no. It's what do you do after the no to try and keep working for your goal.
All right. Scooter Altman, veteran of 4 Space Shuttle missions, test pilot, retired Navy captain, and the real life Maverick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Really enjoyed talking with you, David. Thanks so much for having me on.
Pleasure.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Mike, what have we got going on this week?
Let's talk about the NASA budget. It feels like we're always talking about the NASA budget, but this week it's a little more concrete than what we've talked about in the past. And the reason is the Office of Management and Budget came out with what's known as a skinny budget, which means we have some top line figures, but not really all of the information we would traditionally see about this time with the budget. And for NASA, it just frankly does not look good. It's about a $6 billion cut from a percentage situation. One of the largest cuts, if not the largest cut for sure, in NASA history. But what's getting a lot of attention is it calls for the cancellation of the Lunar Gateway, ending the Space Launch System, the SLS system, the Orion programs after Artemis 3, and termination of some science missions like the Mars sample return. And so this is obviously a huge deal for the space community, and it's going to have a lot of repercussions. We are already seeing some folks in the European Space Agency say, "Hey, this is going to be a prime mover at their June meeting." We have seen a lot of response from the Hill. I would say somewhat predictably, Democrats have been fairly outraged by the figures. We've seen a lot of concern from industry groups. The one in particular I would note is the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. And what I think is really interesting there is that there are some prime contractors, some of these big contractors, Boeing and Northrop Grumman are both on SLS, Lockheed Martin, which is on Orion. They're part of these coalitions. And so I think what's really going to happen these next couple of weeks is we're going to really see lobbyists for those big companies go to work and see how these cuts sit, because it is really the axe is swung, and it's not pretty right now.
It's also interesting in the context that, when we've seen cuts in the past, like the aftermath of the Apollo programs and the moon landings,
Yep.
like cuts in the 1970s, or, the post-Cold War period and sort of a readjustment in terms of budgets. Oftentimes what you see is just sort of a downsizing of ambitions when it relates to space. That's not the case here. We're seeing a sort of a ramping up, obviously a greater reliance on the commercial sector. But oh, by the way, the commercial sector relies on federal funds that are often directed through NASA. So, like
Yeah.
it's the wash of money kind of circles its way through Washington. But we don't see this often in terms of such. I don't know if we've ever seen this kind of cut, but a cut that happens in tandem with an expansion of exploration, at least dialogue that's talking about the moon and Mars, and I mean, there's other groups that are talking about Venus, with Peter Beck, and that's obviously
Yeah.
sort of the outsourcing a little bit to the commercial sector, but. I mean, gosh, it's just like the ambitions in the space economy and this sort of burgeoning industry, I don't know have ever been as big as they are. And yet we're also seeing a shrinking. So, maybe that's part of just sort of like, I don't know. I guess I'd like to get your take on this, Mike, because when you look at SLS, right, and you look at Orion, there were some problems there. I don't think you can
Yeah.
objectively look at those programs and not see them as problems. I mean, I think, former NASA Administrator Mike Griffin called the Artemis program generally excessively complex, unrealistically priced, compromises crew safety. Of course, this is the same Administrator Griffin who said he wasn't like really convinced on the commercial approach to space back when he was administrator. But, putting that aside for a second, there are real problems with this SLS. This came about during the Obama administration. Orion is even longer than that. This was supposed to be cheaper. They were using refurbished parts. I think like the oldest one was a booster aft skirt from 1984 from a shuttle that Northrop Grumman had refurbished. So like all of this was meant to be cheaper, and it just wasn't. It was delayed. It was maybe a little bit hamstrung in terms of the architecture of what it was in development as opposed to the new commercial push. And so there's real legitimacy to questioning the nature of these programs. I think the head scratcher comes in terms of the science programs and in terms of, who's in the driver's seat in terms of setting American space policy going forward. And what does that look like? And what are the legal constraints in terms of what's written into law? There's so many questions that are wrapped into this skinny budget that was just a sort of a brief document that I think has, like you said, those in Capitol Hill and those in Texas kind of scrambling.
I think anyone who's spent any amount of time around the space community, one of the first things you're always told is space is hard, right? And I think what that unfortunately means is, yes, programs are going to be over budget. Programs are going to be delayed. And I think where there's a gap sometimes is thinking like, hey, this way is going to be so much faster. This way is going to be so much better. I think that's generally not what we've seen over decades and decades, and there's probably a monster stack of GAO reports that can tell you that. That's not to say there's not problems here. There certainly were, and I think what that next direction looks like, it comes at a time where there's going to be, or at least there appears to be, very restrained budgets. But what I would go back to is something that you talk about all the time, which is Congress controls the purse strings here, right? And so I think we're already seeing, particularly on the defense side, where there's been some questions about the size of the defense budget, and we don't know much about what that's going to mean for the Space Force or space. But we've already seen some pushback from Congress saying, like, hey, this isn't really what we were looking for. You know, I know the appropriations chair, Senator Susan Collins, has said, like, hey, Congress controls what happens with the money here. So I think there's still going to be some back and forth, but yeah, right now it does not look good, and it means that there is going to be, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, like you said, not only about strategy, but then how that trickles down to at a program level where, who knows what's going to stick and what won't.
Yeah, and I think also in the context of just there's a bigger question here, right? There's a bigger question in terms of what Washington is doing, what NASA is doing, and what the broader community is doing. And when you look, and this is sort of the next sort of topic we were going to talk about, when you look at former Google chief executives like Eric Schmidt, who are now majority stakeholder controllers and CEOs of space companies. I'm talking about Relativity Space that he took over in early of this year. There's a bigger play to be had in terms of not only the exploration efforts and everything that was sort of baked into Artemis, but the sheer commercial development of what's happening both in LEO and GEO and NEO and to some extent cislunar. And I wanted to talk about this because I feel like this is really it's maybe just an underreported topic. I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit on Space News, but Eric Schmidt, speaking at the House Committee on Energy and Commerce about the future of AI and U.S. competitiveness, turned a lot of heads recently, and it became clear that he acquired Relativity because of data centers in space and the energy requirements and the impacts of not having the kind of investment necessarily on the federal side domestically that you can start to look. And he was sort of beseeching lawmakers to really double down in terms of the energy requirements. He's saying basically we need energy from you in all its forms. And he said something like these are things on an industrial scale that I've never seen in my life. This is a former chief executive of Google saying this. Right. And I mean, I was kind of like parsing some of the numbers a little bit and looking at what we just consume in terms of data. And humanity at large generates an average about 320 million terabytes of data every day. Google alone processes nearly 100,000 searches per second, or 2 trillion searches annually. And all of that requires a lot of energy. And now you have AI in the mix, and now you have quantum computing starting to pick up speed. And the sheer power requirements of all these things, not to mention how you cool these things. Space is kind of advantageous for both of those things, based on both coolant and the continuous energy source in the sun. And so this is, and he's confirmed this is why Eric Schmidt is looking at space.
Confirmed via tweet, I believe.
Via tweet, one word, yes. But it's nonetheless, I think it's just it's an interesting shift in terms of, and we've always talked about space companies things that you wouldn't consider, right? Toyota's a space company now. Walmart's a space company because they're monitoring sort of traffic patterns of during holiday season with the technologies that have to do with satellite surveillance. But this is talking about real infrastructure in space and a migration of what's I hate to use this term, but always heard data is the new oil type of thing. I loathe that.
That is the new ammunition is the other one that's you hear all the time.
But nonetheless, I mean, this is a bedrock of our economy, and it's moving in on orbit in one of the most prominent companies, or at least heads of one of the most prominent companies that the 21st and 20th century has ever known. And talking about Google, so it's just It's interesting in the context of what that means in terms of our industry and the space economy at large.
Yeah, I was, you know, what I'm always struck by with Eric Schmidt in particular is um, obviously he has the Google and the Alphabet pedigree, and you're exposed to a lot of technology there. He also led the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence with Bob Work, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense. He also was the chair of the Defense Innovation Advisory Board. So
Right.
he has seen, I would say, at a very intimate level, a lot of the emerging technology that's out there, and where he chooses to invest or where he chooses to spend his time. Um, you I would watch that very carefully, and I think relativity here is the kind of play you're talking about. I think that's one that, all right, if this is the type of infrastructure that's necessary, like, let's see how that's going to happen, because so far we haven't seen that on a grand scale yet. Maybe in small pieces and bits and bytes, but not on a large level. The other thing I find really interesting about this, and something you and I have talked about before, is like this changes kind of how the applications of space. This changes how we think of what we are relying on space for, and it gets right back to the NASA budget question, which is like, is there a shift away from the ethereal and the hypothetical to something that we can very directly have a business case for and very directly have an application for? And that's why I think these two stories are so interesting to kind of juxtapose against each other, exactly for that, because this, if it works, could be, a very real, a very tangible application to how people operate on a day-to-day basis and relying on space in a much more heavy way.
I mean, it is also, frankly, why it's so interesting to be a part of this, because it is that nexus between the practical and the market requirements of the day and the wonderment of what could be and the possibility of what's going forward. And, I think there are those who sort of look at cuts to NASA and questions of those who are doing science for science sake, and that they wonder if you have this like expansive purview, is there something lost in the go-between? But I will say one other thing about Eric Schmidt. I mean, he also worked pretty closely with Pete Worden over at NASA Ames,
Yep.
and
Yep.
Pete and Eric were doing a lot of work in terms of emerging quantum technologies, and to see where the two of those individuals are. Pete Worden now at Breakthrough, which is thinking about interstellar stuff, and Eric Schmidt, who's left Google behind, is now atop a space company. It's hard not to get the sense and the impression that is like investment ramps up, and people with big ideas and a lot of money behind them in the private sector, and a federal government that seems to be like this, at least in terms of some of these carve-outs. There seems to be an exception in terms of where it's pushing. I'm talking about
Yeah.
exploration, not in terms of the cuts. Um, and then in tandem with the commercial space stations and just the growing commercial activity up there, it's hard not to just kind of like sit back, start eating some popcorn and just kind of want to see where all this is heading.
Yeah. And see if the money is, if it's going to be enough. Because as you started this segment with, that so much of the money comes through Washington that touches the entire industry. And so if there are $6 billion less in NASA, how does that trickle down, and what does that mean for the space industry at large? And where are the companies that can make it now and can't, and which ones can find a way to succeed in other ways? And I think it's going to be a really compelling time.
All right.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Thanks so much for watching. If you have ideas on how NASA should be spending its budget or what the next application of space is, we'd love to hear from you. We're at spaceminds@spacenews.com. I'm Mike Bruce.
And I'm David Ariosto. Thanks so much for joining us here on Space Minds.